Hi, Tracy Hugelmeyer here from VintagepreneurUniversity.com, where I help vintage sellers start, grow, and scale their business on Etsy. And I also own my own vintage business on Etsy, Rustic, that I've had since 2013. And I absolutely love what I do. So today what I want to share with you is something that I've been thinking about for quite some time. And if you've been following me for any amount of time, you know that I talk about the importance of having a niche and knowing your target market. And what I've decided to do for Rustic is take my existing niche and narrow it down even further. And I'm going to talk to you about why I'm doing that today and explain that a little bit further for you. And then I'm going to have a series of videos that I share with you on this experience so you can kind of see how it's going for me and see if maybe it's something that you want to consider for your own vintage business on Etsy as well. So first, a quick review or introduction for if you haven't heard about what a niche is or a target market yet at this point in your journey. A niche is a targeted, focused segment of the population that you sell to, and then the related products or services that you provide them. So let's say your niche is trendy women in the dating scene looking for some bling, and the related products that you sell them are trending vintage jewelry with premium pricing. In a nutshell, you get very specific about what you're selling and who you're selling to. Okay, here we are in my shop, Rustic, and what I wanted to show you is kind of what I have my niche set up as currently. I'm in the process of transitioning here, so I'm taking you through my journey with me, and I'm showing you where I'm at now, where I was at, and where I'm headed. So you can see that I have vintage, farmhouse, industrial, decor, and general store right here in my banner. And then underneath that, in my title, I have vintage decor, farmhouse decor, and letterpress letters. Now, I'm primarily, or was primarily, targeting farmhouse decor. And even though I had success with that, I still felt like I was too all over the place. And it was a little bit difficult to get my messaging correct because I was all over the place. I hadn't narrowed down enough. And I know that narrowing down is sort of counterintuitive, and especially to hyper niche, which is what I'm doing to my shop, hyper niching, because it feels like if you have a bigger variety, then you can attract more people and sell more, right? But really, when it comes down to it, if you aren't attracting a very particular target market or targeted section, people are less likely to know what you have to offer for them and then to buy from you as a result. And it becomes much harder to market, get returning customers, and I could go on and on. Now, I could have stopped here because was doing perfectly fine with my niche being vintage, farmhouse, and industrial decor and general store. I had over 4,000 sales on Etsy. So we might be wondering, why did I make this decision to hyper niche down even further? Well, over the last couple years, I've kind of hyper niched naturally into vintage typography items like vintage letterpress and vintage rubber stamps. And if you look at my Instagram and Pinterest and my social media, which I don't really spend a lot of time on these days, but I'm primarily targeting the vintage farmhouse world. And like I said, it was working for the most part. However, my gut was telling me that I should change direction a little bit and hyper niche to vintage typography. I was paying attention to the cues in my world, and these are some of the things that led me to my decision. My customers come to me primarily for vintage typography items. So I was still stocking non-typography items, but not as much anymore. And this was around the May timeframe that I started really making this transition more aggressively. And at that time, a majority of my sales were vintage typography items by far. So I was getting these clues regardless of what I was doing. My customers were coming back again and again for vintage typography items. They were telling me that that's what they wanted by doing that. They rarely would, for example, buy a vintage scale and then come back for some letterpress. I mean, of course, that could happen, and it did happen, but it was much more rare for that to happen. So I was paying attention to those cues, and other things that were happening were, people in my social media world were referring to me as like the go-to vintage typography shop. And also, I was getting really good at those types of items. I was becoming an expert at vintage letterpress and vintage rubber stamps, which is, the primary things that I was focusing on. And, I knew how to get more of what I needed at the price points I needed to make a good profit. And additionally, I love selling vintage typography items, like really, really love it. So all of these things are what kind of led me to my decision to hyper niche further down into vintage typography. And don't get me wrong, I'm not completely getting rid of my farmhouse stuff. But I'm just hyper niching further down so that I'm more crystal clear on what I'm selling so that I can get my messaging out to the world and become even more of an expert and attract even more of the customers, and have them come back because I have what they want. So when you're figuring out your niche, it's not about you, it's about your customers. It's a little about you too, but it's mostly about your customers. And there, of course, are some obvious downsides of this transition, and I'll touch on those a little bit later. But I've started making the transition over the last couple months quite aggressively, and I've seen a huge change in my sales. And right now, the biggest thing that I can attribute to that change, and it's a good change, by the way, like my sales have gone up dramatically since I made this change. I attribute it to niching down. So like I mentioned, and as you can see, I'm still in the middle of transitioning over to my new hyper niche of vintage typography. I got to update my banner, my title, and I have to update my sections. But I'm starting to weed out a lot of my decor items that were strictly, my farmhouse decor and industrial decor, and concentrating more on the typography items. So that's a little kind of backstory and summary of what I'm doing in my shop Rustic Eye as far as niching down, hyper niching to vintage typography. And I will continue to take you through my journey in future videos. So stay tuned for that. Make sure you are subscribed to my channel so you don't miss it, and click the little bell so you get notified whenever a new video comes out as well. And finally, if you haven't joined my holiday prep challenge yet, it's going on right now and it's not too late to join, but it almost is. So hop on over. I will link to it in the notes below. And if you're a little late, that's fine. Just jump right in. I'll get you caught up. And even if it's way after the challenge, check it out anyway, because I'm going to get you hooked up with my best tips and resources. And of course, you'll always have the opportunity to join future challenges and trainings. And by the way, the Holiday Prep Challenge is completely free. So I will see you there. And thank you so much for joining me today. Bye-bye.